Bonjour, bienvenue à notre nouvel épisode de Parlons des Papotins.
Hello, and welcome to our new Tush Talks. My name is Carine Legault. I am a member of the patient support team at Colorectal Cancer Canada. During this episode, we'll talk about the patient experience following their involvement in a clinical trial, as well as the role of the clinical research nurse. We have with us Marie-Pier Lessard. Marie-Pier is a nurse clinician in clinical research with the Solid Tumours Study Group at the Maisonneuve-Rosemont Hospital, which is dedicated to the oncology research for breast cancer, digestive cancers, gynecological cancers, lung cancers, and urological cancers. Marie-Pier also has a certification from the Canadian Nurses Association in oncology, as well as experience with this clientele. So thank you, Marie-Pier, for joining us. Thank you, Carine, for the invitation. So we're going to talk about, we have the question often, what's the experience like participating in a clinical trial? And I think it was important to share with patients what is the day-to-day experience to inform them on how their experience could be once they get involved in the clinical trial. I think it's a bit sort of vague, and we wanted to shed as much light as possible on that research. So can you explain your role as a clinical research nurse? Yes, well, the role of the nurse can vary from one center to another. So I know that some centers, it's a coordinator who does the same roles. So patients may be dealing with a coordinator who's not a nurse but has the same role as I do. So I just wanted to mention that. It's not reserved for nurses. So basically, we have 3 nurses in our team, and we follow up with patients from the moment they are referred for a trial. So the first time they hear about the trial, we'll contact them immediately. We will educate them, so explain, so what is the trial about? What are the possible side effects? What's the follow-up? So everything. We explain the treatments, how everything is going to happen. We also follow up during the treatment. So if ever the patient has a question, a symptom, whatever, they can call us. And we're going to try and help them over the phone. And if needed, we'll discuss with the doctor to try and manage the situation. So we're a resource for the patient during the study. Also, in research, we see the patient every time they come to the hospital. They also see their research nurse. So we do a tight follow-up. There are other things that don't necessarily have to do with the patient that we do in research. So every blood test results, scan results, side effect reported, new symptoms, we need to input that in a database that will then be anonymized, so we don't identify the patient, so it's impossible to do that. And then we send all the information to the people working for the company doing the clinical trial, who will then analyze the data. So there is part of that where we discuss with them, we input into the database, but it's really just being a resource person for the people, for the doctors. We coordinate the different exams, the different appointments, discuss with the doctors, make sure follow-ups are done properly. So patients who are in a clinical trial will have a resource to help them throughout the process as though they had a pivot nurse. I was going to say you're a central point for the participant and you're a key element in their process throughout the clinical research. Yes, exactly. When I used to be a pivot nurse, I followed up the same way with patient. In research, we see them more often. We have fewer patients, and we see them every time they come in. But in terms of support, when they're at home, it's identical. And once a patient, and you did discuss this already, but once a patient with the doctor, his oncologist, they've decided on a trial, that it would be a good trial for them. How does it work for the patient? So what, do they call you? Would the doctor call you to integrate them to the clinical trial? Yes. It always depends who refers the patient. So some patients will find the clinical trials themselves through Quebec, for example. They will call us directly, and that happens sometimes. So obviously we speak to them directly. Sometimes it's the oncologist from another hospital who refers them, or an oncologist within the hospital who's not involved in the trial. So in that case, we then have to organize a meeting with the investigator, so the oncologist who's in charge of the trial in our center. Now, once we discuss with that oncologist, if they're interested, then they meet the nurse and then we go into details. So we explain all the details, what's the clinical trial, what are the follow-ups, how often, how many blood tests, how often. We also compare with the treatment that the oncology, if they weren't participating in the study. So what to expect, basically. We also give them a consent. It's called the information form. The consent and information form, sorry. I never use the whole name. So it's a big document that explains all the side effects, the follow-up. So everything that the nurse and doctor have just explained is written down in these forms, and then we encourage the patient to discuss with their family, their loved ones, and read, and then come back with questions. And from that point on, we need to think. Even if we're really motivated, you need to think at least 24 hours, minimum 24 hours before deciding. Obviously, sometimes when patients are seen by the oncologist, who's also the study investigator, well, then we don't need to add another appointment to explain. So the investigators, they follow patients who are not doing research. So they have an oncology clinic every Tuesday, for example. They see 30 patients who are not doing research, and they have the clinic on Wednesdays for the research. So the investigators, who's already their doctor, will then discuss it, and then if they're interested, we'll just switch them and meet with them. And then during the thinking process, we're always available for questions, doctors as well. It can be over the phone, it can be platform where they just ask questions. And if ever the patient has the opportunity to choose whether they want to participate or just not, yes, the fact of meeting us doesn't commit them to anything. It's just gathering information. And if the patient doesn't want to participate, we ensure that the regular follow-up continues or started, depending. And if the patient decides to participate, that's where we proceed to the consent. And from the moment they consent and sign, then we can start the process for research. As long as the consent isn't signed, there's nothing we can start. We can't scan for the research. We can't administer a treatment. There's nothing we can do. Perfect. And once the consent is signed, are there other steps? Are there medical questionnaires to complete? You talked about scans, so I assume it depends on each study, what the starting point is. Yes, it really depends on the study. It's never the same, but generally we start with the eligibility. Now, if the doctor talked to you about the study, if we met with you, it's because we know it's the right cancer, the right treatments were given before, no contraindications or nothing major to participating in the study. And then once the consent is signed, that's when we go into details. Then we do all the medical history, drugs that patients take. We'll do an ECG, blood test to make sure that everything's okay. So the chart can be great, and then in the study they say, for example, have a hemoglobin over 90. Well, we don't know as long as we haven't done the blood test. So even if we're really motivated, all criteria work, there's sometimes a small little thing that can be a hiccup, and that's the determination of eligibility phase. And they often request that we redo some scans. Sometimes we need to meet specialists. So if we know, for example, that the treatment could cause, for example, eye problems, Well, it's possible that we may need an ophthalmologist to do a basic scan. So if ever there's a problem, well, then at least we have a baseline to know if it's new or changed, and that helps with the follow-up. So that's really what happens at the beginning. We need to make sure all of that is done before we start. Sometimes they ask, some studies that aren't as advanced, they ask for biopsies. So obviously that's discussed with the doctor. It's going to be discussed broadly to make sure that it's deemed safe. And it's not hidden from the patient. Patients would know before signing the consent that there's a biopsy. And often they ask us to ask the pathology department to provide a sample of tumor cells that was already taken up in the past, either by surgery or biopsy. 5 years ago is okay. We don't need to redo it often. And finally, if all of that is good in the eligibility period, which normally takes up to 28 days, then generally we do it as quickly as possible, depending on the patient's symptoms, depending on how the patients want. I have to say that my patients, if it's close to the holidays, they're not in a rush. But generally, we try to do it as quickly as possible to do the treatment as quickly as possible. And once the patient has gone through the eligibility period and we determine that they meet all criteria, I'm going to ask you as a comparison. So a patient receiving standard of care versus clinical trial, is there a lot of difference in terms of experience of receiving the treatment? Well, the treatment itself, not really. The appointments, it is a bit different with the pandemic. Now, a lot of oncologists will do phone interviews, phone appointments as standard. But in research, it is in person. We need to see the patients. But generally, once it's started, most of the studies, the first cycle, the first month, the first 2 months, they ask us to see the patients more often to make sure that everything's going well, that we have a good start. And then normally it's before every cycle, which is often before every treatment, which is the same as standard. Anyway, in my hospital, it's the same as for standard treatment. They need to be evaluated before they need to do blood tests, and that doesn't change. So it's fairly similar. Sometimes appointments in research can be longer because we ask more extensive questions. Like you can't just say to the doctor, you've had nausea and now it's done. We need to know how long it lasted, what drug was taken. We need to document everything. And it also means that we can help patients because we have more information on their symptoms. So it's a win-win. Otherwise, on the day of the treatment itself, sometimes there's a little bit more entertainment during the treatment. So normally patients go to the treatment room, they get the treatment from the nurse who's there that day. But in research, sometimes the research nurse needs to be there as well. So sometimes we have blood tests that need to be done during the treatment to evaluate how we metabolize the drug. What do you metabolize, and understand how all that works out in the blood with the cancer. It's not all trials that require that. The calendar sometimes is already written. So that's information that patients will have before they participate anyway. So that can be different during the treatment. Sometimes, blood tests or ECGs during treatment, things like that. But in my hospital, patients receive the treatment as every other treatment with the nurses who, for those who've already received treatments, it's nurses they know. And at any time during the trial, if there's a problem, there's always a contact point. If they had side effects or if they have questions, there's always someone available to answer their questions. Is that right? Yes. And like pivot nurses, not during the weekend, but yes, during the week, yes, they have the research team information. For our centers, yes, we're the ones who answer their questions. And once you're done the treatment cycle, which has been predetermined at the moment of consent, do patients often need to supply information from the clinical research team? Any other questionnaires, other tests? Does it last over a certain period of time? Yes, so it depends on the trials. So some studies, it's predetermined. So let's say the easiest, like if they've already received surgery and they've had 12 treatments after surgery, well, we've anticipated the 12 treatments, and that's predetermined. But sometimes, depending on the trials and the stage of the disease, it's not predetermined. So sometimes it's like standard treatment, so you can receive the treatment as long as the patient feels good, does well with the treatment, that the doctor judges that things are going well, and the cancer isn't progressing or isn't recurring, depending. So there are scans required usually during the studies, and there's a few more than in a regular treatment. So let's say if it's every 12 weeks, it really needs to be every 12 weeks. We don't have a lot of leeway. Everything is very strict in research. Everything needs to be done based on a predetermined schedule. So when we finish the treatment, again, depends on the study, but generally, if we stop the treatment, but it's not because of progression, then that means we don't need to receive another chemotherapy treatment or something else. Everything's fine. Or if there were side effects, but we don't need to start another treatment, we're still going to continue the scans usually. So we usually do that. And then once the scans are done, generally, we have more long-term follow-ups. These are survival follow-ups. That's what we call them. So the sponsors, they want long-term survival data. So a patient who's seen in my hospital has nothing to do for that. They don't even realize it. They know because we tell them, but they don't realize it. I look at their chart. When's the next appointment? Last appointment. We fill that into the database. Okay, they've seen the doctor. They've gotten chemo. And then people who are seen elsewhere, I do need to call them every few months to validate the information, but they don't need to come to the hospital. It's very rare to have trials that ask for you to come back to the hospital after the treatment is done. Perfect. I think that really gives us a lot of information about the trials, and it gives us a nice snapshot of what patients should expect in the process and long-term as well. Some questions come back from patients in terms of, so are there costs associated for the patient, or is everything paid for or included under the RAMQ in Quebec or other, provincial insurance? Well, the treatment themselves are covered. There is nothing to pay for medical appointments, even if we send to specialists, scans, even if it's in a private clinic, because often we deal with private clinics because they're too busy in hospitals. So especially for the scans, our schedule is more restrictive, but patients have nothing to pay for that. If the doctor needs to prescribe medication, like for example, high blood pressure, well, patients will have to pay for the medication at their pharmacy, at Jean Coutu, or as though it was prescribed normally. We cannot give them. But all treatments, care received at the hospital are covered, like for any other patient. Certain trials, and this is included in the consent form, certain trials anticipate a budget where we're not paying the patients, but we can compensate certain travels. Some trials have more frequent traveling versus regular treatment. So sometimes we can cover the parking, for example. That way they don't have to pay for it, or cafeteria if they need to come very often. It really depends on the trials. Perfect. Another question we receive often is, would you sometimes use placebos, or does the patient always receive a treatment as though he wasn't part of the clinical trial? So there are some trials using placebo, and if we are using a placebo in a trial, it's because we've already tested the medication on humans, on patients who had cancer, and we found the most tolerated dose for participants. So then at that point, we're testing and we're comparing the regular treatment to the new treatment. So that's usually when we have placebos. So to answer the question, will the patients at least get a treatment? It depends. So if normally in the normal follow-up, if they're not participating in the trial, if their treatment was nothing, like active monitoring, that often happens in treatments where patients have received surgery. So there's no adjuvant treatment, there's no treatment after the surgery. So patients are just followed by the surgeon or oncologist, and we do scans and blood tests to make sure that there's no relapse, or if there is a relapse, well, we catch it quickly. So in that case, we could have a study where patients receive the experimental treatment or placebo. So placebo, just a quick reminder, it looks like a medication in appearance, but there's nothing. There's no active substance. So, for example, saline. For a pill, it can be a sugar pill, but it looks exactly like the real medication pill. So these patients could receive nothing, just a placebo, but that would be equivalent to what they would receive if they hadn't been part of the trial. So in clinical trials for cancers where there's already an approved treatment and we're using a placebo, so if we're talking about phase 2 where we're not using placebo, it's different. But when there's the use of a placebo, we're going to have to give at least the standard treatment. So if there's already chemotherapy that's used to treat that disease at that stage, well, there's a group receiving that chemotherapy with the experimental medication, like immunotherapy, for example, and there's a group that will receive the same chemotherapy and a placebo. So at least everybody gets chemotherapy, what they would have received, but we still have a group receiving only chemotherapy so that we can in fact compare the side effect between the groups and the efficacy of the treatments. So we really need to compare apples and apples here. And I assume patients can ask questions before the beginning of the clinical trial to find out what type of treatment they could potentially receive as well. Those are questions they can ask. Yes, and before they participate, we need to know all options, all treatments that we could receive, whether it's in trials or not. And also trials with placebos. We know there are placebos, it's clearly indicated. However, we cannot find out during the trial. I don't know, they don't know, the doctor doesn't know. The only people who know is those who analyze the data, because it would be hard to find out what works. But the whole treatment team, we don't know what they received. That's why we call it blinded. Perfect. Thank you for that answer, because that's one that comes back very often, and that was explained very easily, very nicely, easy to understand, and it answers a lot of patients' questions. And my last question is basically, you've mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but patients who participate in a clinical trial, do they have more medical appointments than those who don't participate? Well, it will depend. Usually there are a little bit more. It's rarely a lot more. It depends on what phase. So very experimental studies, it's the first time we try this medication on patients, like phase 1 studies, then there's a lot of appointments. But when it's studies where we're comparing medications with regular treatments, it's similar. It's mostly a lot more scans, a few more blood tests, but in terms of medical appointments, once it's started, it's not really that much more. more at the beginning, but once it's started, then it's similar. It's comparable. You also said it means a tighter follow-up with the patient, so there is an advantage as well. Yes, for patients who like being aware of their files, their blood tests, having tight follow-ups and close follow-ups is an advantage. Thank you very much, Marie-Pier. Thank you for participating today. Thank you for answering all of our questions. And we hope that if there are additional questions, patients can contact support at cancercolorectalcanada.com, and we'll share your questions with Marie-Pier as well. And if ever people need more information about clinical research, you can also look on the Cancer Colorectal Canada website. There's a section there, and other videos will come in our series on shedding light on clinical trials. Thank you, Marie-Pier. Thank you.